Hello everybody, this is Albert with Green Tea House. I hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to talk about white peony tea, otherwise known as Bay Mudon. Now before we begin, I recommend that you check out our past episodes, in particular the episodes that have to deal with white tea. And if you're a novice or novitiate to tea in general, I would definitely recommend, and I'll put a banner here for the introductory playlist on what is tea, the differences between the different teas, and what's a herbal versus something that comes from the Camellia sinensis plant. Speaking of the Camellia sinensis plant, white tea comes from the Camellia sinensis plant. It's one of the 6 colored teas that come from this plant. Red tea or rhubarb is not, even though it's red tea, is a colored tea. It does not come from this plant. That comes from South Africa. White tea is probably, as I mentioned in the white tea episode, one of the least consumed, especially compared to green, black, and oolong. Now, white peony is probably, I would say, one of the more popular white teas. It's grown in the Fujian province of China, which is kind of near Taiwan and the southeastern part of China. Silver needle is another very popular one, and that is a more of a high-end white tea, whereas white peony is more, I guess you could say, consumer-friendly white tea. And so look, what's the difference between white tea, otherwise known as Bay Mudon, and let's say its closest neighbor, which is a green tea? So as we talked about in previous episodes, a green tea is when they pick the leaves of the Camellia sinensis plant and then they kill green it, which means it's not going to be oxidized at all before they roll it, and then they're going to dry it and then ship it off. The fundamental difference here is with white tea, and especially with white peony, as opposed to some of the other white teas, they're going to pluck and use the youngest leaves. That's what they do in white peony. They're going to use the very youngest shoots of the Camellia sinensis plant. And then what they're going to do is they're going to wither it. And depending on the weather, this could be anywhere from 1 to 3 days. They just leave it out in the sun. They don't really touch it. They don't bruise it like you do with oolongs because they don't want to oxidize it. So by leaving it in the sun for 1 to 3 days, there's going to be slight oxidation, about 5%. So unlike green teas, which are 0%, because as soon as they pluck them, they kill green it. In China, they typically pan fry it, and in Japan, they're going to steam it. So with white tea, it's slightly oxidized. And then after they leave it out in the sun for 1 to 3 days, then they're going to pile it up on each other's leaves, which leads to part of the reason why there's a slight oxidation. But they don't want to touch it, bruise it too much, because then you're going to oxidize it more, and that's going to lead to essentially, aside from the rolling that has to do with oolong, if they mess with the cellular structure too much, it's going to be oxidized to 10-15%. At that point, you're looking at a light oxidized oolong. So a white tea, like a white peony, is going to be oxidized about 5%. So they sun it, wither it 1 to 3 days, then they pile it up, and then they dry it, and boom, they ship it. And so because it takes so long in the preparation of like having tea be there 1 to 3 days, depending on rain, this is one of the reasons why white tea isn't as mass produced as green tea, and certainly the biggest mass produced tea out there is black tea. And because of this, it's not produced as much because it's a more intensive tea. Kind of like with yellow tea is another one that's pretty intensive. White tea is pretty intensive, and therefore it's going to be one of the reasons why it just isn't as consumed or isn't as popular. Now with white tea, in particular white peony, the taste is going to be, I would tell you, kind of fruity. It's going to be mellow. It's not going to be stringent at all. It's just a light, subtle tea. And if you're used to drinking green teas and you go to a white peony, you're going to notice it definitely has a different taste. But not too different than a green, because remember, green 0% oxidized and white peony is 5% oxidized. But there's going to be a subtle taste. And as I mentioned in the video for white tea is one of those real subtle teas where if you drink a pu'er, like a dark tea, or you drink a black tea, you know you're drinking these things. White tea is one of those you got to just drink a lot of to notice the differences between, let's say, a silver needle, which we sell seasonally, and a white peony, which we sell all the time. There's going to be subtle differences. So if you want to become like the wine snob of teas, then drink a lot of white teas, because white teas definitely require the sommelier kind of version of tea drinking, because it's the most subtle in its differences. How should you steep it? White peony, I would tell you, is kind of like a green in terms of you don't want to overburn it because it'll get way too stringent, and that's one of the beauties of white peony, is that it's not stringent. So I do about 170, 175, and then like with all things, a session, it would be steeping it 3 times. The liqueur, or the color of it, yeah, a good one's going to be kind of like a goldenish color. It's like a goldenish color. And I get it. In the tea world, there's the colors are pretty much almost always subtle shades. I mean, you're not going to find something that's super different. But either way, white peony, takeaway, 5% oxidized. Not that popular in terms of globally a classification of tea, white tea in general, but white peony or Bay Boudin is probably the most well-known and approachable of the white teas because of its fruity flavor and because of its cost-friendly price point. So definitely check them out. The website, like I mentioned, we sell this tea all the time. Guys, post in the comments. Let me know what your take is on white tea. Until next time, take care. God bless.